On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jocelyn Brown, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Ohio University, with training in gerontology, applied sociology, and applied psychology. Originally from West Virginia, her scholarship centers Black Appalachian life across the life course. She has a particular focus on health disparities, structural racism, and the political economic conditions shaping Black communities in Appalachia, the wider U.S., and the African diaspora. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jocelyn Brown, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Ohio University. How are you doing today, Dr. Brown?
Well, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. So, we can dive in. How did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of the field?
Yeah, so my wading into Black Studies was very unorthodox. So my background, my PhD is in gerontology, so that's the study of aging, and it's very public health adjacent. I'm very interested in health disparities as they accrue across the Black American life course. And so I did a year of my doctoral program in South Florida, and of course, Florida is the land of aging. And I was kind of at a fork in the road at that point, right? In terms of, do I want to go into aging? Do I want to go into like Black studies of some sort, right? And seeing just how, frankly, over-resourced a lot of schools are in South Florida when it comes to the white middle class, upper middle class demographic that they're serving down there really kind of like radicalized me. And so I'm from West Virginia. I'm from the Eastern Panhandle, so that is only about an hour and a half from Baltimore. So I transferred. I did my first master's in Baltimore, and then transferred back after my year in Tampa. And so during that process, I really got into the root causes of health disparities and socioeconomic disparities in the country, right? And just seeing like the stark differences between what white people have when they reach 65 and older versus what Black Americans have when they reach, if they reach 65 and older. So I have my PhDs in gerontology. I have a master's in psychology and a master's in sociology, right? And I chose to do a PhD because I did not want to go in for counseling licensure based off of this understanding that a lot of the stressors Black Americans are facing, the depression, the anxiety, even though we have better or even comparable health outcomes compared to white Americans, a lot of that is rooted in systemic and structural injustice, right? And so for me, it just was not enough to kind of sit there and try to help mitigate those symptoms, those stressors. I was really interested in studying what they are at the root, right? And so I kind of came to Black Studies in a very roundabout way. And so I did my dissertation on racial capitalism. The Cedric Robinson's thesis that racism and capitalism are inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing, and how that impacts Black Americans as they age. And so there was a position open at Ohio University for African American Studies tenure track position, but they wanted someone to carve out a health track. And so that was me. So that's kind of how I got into African American Studies. I've been there since. And so typically when people hear African American Studies, they think humanities, right? So they think like art, literature, history, which of course those are key components of what I talk about in my classroom, and also core to the discipline, but more and more it's more interdisciplinary, right? And so part of what I do is kind of reframing that understanding of what African American Studies is.
Thank you. So that leads to, how do you situate yourself disciplinarily, right? Like having that background in gerontology, that is very different for somebody who is working in a Black Studies department. I think it's fascinating. Um, what elements, right, of gerontology, um, do you feel like you bring to Black Studies? And then, like, what Black Studies elements do you think are integral for the type of research that you do?
Yeah, I work in okay, I have a joint appointment with the public health and African American studies, right? And so I'm kind of like I'm caught in the crosshairs many ways with people who are very siloed and who are very not used to talking to one another, and especially when it comes to the external perception of African American studies aren't all that interested because they don't under first of all, black no one cares, frankly, about Black Americans other than Black Americans, really. And even if they do, they don't fully see how their own oppression as white people, as Latino people, as Asian people, as queer people, whatever, they don't fully see the relation of the discipline to um their own studies, right? Put it
Mhm,
that way. They power a key um, focal point of Black studies and African American studies in particular is the role of power, right? And in academia, it's kind of like racism um, and all the isms, right, are just kind of like a matter of fact, not something that is structural and not something that really can be measured or really that much done about it, right? And so a lot of what I do is kind of like I'm kind of the middleman, trying to get them to understand that African American studies is not just like learning about Martin Luther King, like seriously. And then on the African American study side is getting them to think more broadly about the social implications of what is happening and why it's happening, right? Most of my African American studies colleagues are in English and history, and I've learned so much from them. They have broken my brain over the last 2 years, right? This idea that you don't need to explain, like, art is just for the sake of art. You can examine it however you want to, but dance and even like the way people express stress or how people cook, right? It doesn't necessarily have to do anything. And as a
mhm.
social scientist, you're kind of I was trained by a social worker. You're always focused on, okay, so what? Who cares? A completely different frame of inquiry, and I really appreciate that about them. And so my training, in sociology, psychology, gerontology is public health, right? It touches uh on how to bridge the gap. Um, I hope that answers the question. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. I do wanna ask a follow-up.
Sure.
Uh, with regards to your scholarship centering Black Appalachian life specifically, that's not something that I think most people talk about.
Yeah.
Like, when people talk about that region of the country,
Yeah.
they talk about it in terms of white people,
Yeah.
right? So, can you say a little bit about your focus on Black communities in that area, and the importance of that work, especially right now?
Sure. Yeah. There's this. What's interesting about Appalachia, especially northern Appalachia, it's a region of great migration, right? Like, there's people coming in, there's people going out, and it's kind of always been that way. Especially now with the cost of living, you have a lot of city slickers coming in and driving up the cost of living because they can work remotely, right? But just in general, there's this blanketed perception of Appalachia, especially like West Virginia and Kentucky, where I'm from, as being poor, white, backward, inbred, stupid, uneducated, and a demographic that consistently cuts off their nose to spite their face, right? Um, and that isn't true. Appalachia is incredibly diverse, especially people, Black Americans are pocketed just like they are anywhere else. And so, like, for example, and whenever people think about Appalachia, they think coal, right? And they think, oh, it's white men in the coal mines. No, about 20 to 25% of coal miners were Black men, right? Why? Because they came up through the Great Migration. There was a lot of strife between the company men and the coal miners, and they would use Black men to break the strikes, right? They would tell them, "Well, you're not going to work, but guess what? We're going to bring these Black guys in, and we're either going to pay them less, or pay them the same amount. It doesn't matter to us, right? And you have rich history in the region, not just from coal mining, but from the Underground Railroad. I'm from Harper's Ferry, where John Brown's rebellion took place, right? Like, the erasure of Black Appalachians really cannot be understated. And I think a lot of that is because of the classism on behalf of middle class and upper class white Americans who aren't Appalachian onto the region, right? They want to feel superior. But for those who are within the region, there is almost like a power, there's a monopoly on the very little resources and imagery in what is happening, the face of the region, I guess I should say, right? Like, the poor and middle class Appalachians want to control, the narrative. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, right? And so, um, you will hear many, many times the class reductionism, like, "Oh, we're both poor." Like, "I don't have any white privilege because I'm poor just as you are," right? In reality, the poverty rates, the health disparities are about twice as worse for Black Appalachians than they are white Appalachians. So, yes, like, our socioeconomic statuses are not as drastically different, but the power dynamic is still there nonetheless.
Thank you. That's one super important. But also such a it's an integral intervention in, like you said, the narrative, right? Like how people talk about that region and who resides in that region and the implications for the policies, programs, the research that happens there. If you're not considering Black communities, particularly if they do have twice like the health disparities.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And so, like, if you think about, like, if you're gonna craft an intervention for based off of a study, like a survey, or based off of, like, a health data of, like, let's say, a hospital in West Virginia, medicine, right? Like, it's going to be biased off the bat because the people who are easiest to reach and, um are easiest to recruit are going to be, wealthier, they're gonna be healthier, right? And so that demographic many times equals white, right? And so any intervention that you come up with is not necessarily going to be an intersectional intervention.
Thank you. So how does your varied backgrounds, how does that play out in your classrooms? And how it particularly because you are teaching in a Black studies department,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, what does that look like pedagogically?
So So right now I'm teaching a class on a Black woman and a class on Black men and masculinities. I also teach a health disparities class, right? So starting out, and we're only like it's almost week 5, right? Starting out, there's a lot of history. We got to get through the historical foundation of what it is that we're even talking about and what we were prior to the transatlantic slave trade, and fully getting them to grasp the magnitude of slavery, right? And so what I try to do is it is kind of chronological in that sense until we get up to what is happening now. And then we talk about the more sociological, physiological, um, factors that go into, like, the Black experience. So, for example, for Black men, um, right now we're about to this weekend we're talking about the Black Power movement. But eventually we'll talk about fashion, right? So, like, the history of the do-rag. We'll talk about, like, the reading rainbow, and Black boy jewelry, right? And so every week they're interwoven and interconnected, but we're talking about things from a different lens. And so I'll integrate different theories. For example, like, of course, intersectionality is, like, key, right? But other theories like minority stress theory, like, so how is it that Black men, uh, by college mile have the lowest health expectancy, or sorry, life expectancy compared to, white women, right? Despite the fact that people have this idea in their head, which is, by the way, has kind of been co-opted by white feminists, that, well, both Black men and white women are equal in their power dynamic because they are privileged in one way and marginalized in another, but that's not reality, right? There's a misunderstanding of what intersectionality is, and so if you incorporate other theories like minority stress, like cumulative disadvantage theory, you can see like how uh, these types of dynamics show up in different experiences around Black men and masculine. And same for my Black woman class, right? Um, so yeah, I try to. Some things have to be blocked off, right? Just depending on what is happening. But once we get to where we're going, we kind of incorporate them throughout the rest of the semester.
Thank you. So you mentioned earlier that you kind of came to Black studies in a roundabout way. Um, Now that you're there or here, and in a department of Black studies, what do you find most interesting about the past of the field?
Um, how Okay, so Ohio University is the second oldest African American Studies department in the country. It is the major is being so okay, I should give you context. So Ohio has recently passed a SB1, which is conservative legislation to basically dismantle higher ed.
Mhm,
In terms of going after DEI, so like for specific scholarships, specific spaces on campus. So not just Black Americans, but of course we've been hit the hardest, right? And so African American Studies, our major is going to be no more starting in the fall. So that's one problem. Second problem is that for us, does that mean that we're going to be a department going forward or not? Right? We don't know. We don't know. It might be they decide to keep us and we figure it out, what that looks like having a department with no major, or like the respective faculty will go our separate ways. So maybe I might be put with public health. I have colleagues who be put with history, what have you, right? And so I think when I think about like where we were 50, 60 years ago, damn, we've really lost the plot here, guys, right? And I think part of this is because and I've just kind of realized this because I have a colleague from California where it all started. He's very brazen, very radical, and he's struggled with understanding how is it that the Black experience, or I should say, the Black radical tradition exists so differently in Appalachia, right? He doesn't understand, or not to say he doesn't understand. I think he's just the culture shock has been immense because in California, there's a lot of institutional support for this type of thing, where there's a lot of Black community and infrastructure already there. So if you want to go pound the pavement and tear shit up, you can, right? And that's also kind of expected. Here, everything is very much arrested by, of course, white institutions, but you have to understand that the Black people here are enmeshed within the white community. And so that type of tradition in that way cannot necessarily be always expressed. For example, like the MLK brunch that happened a few weeks ago, we had so I'm the advisor to the Black Student Union. The Black Student Union wanted to conduct some sort of protest, but the problem was that the other Black organizations were performing or involved in the brunch, right? And so it created the situation to where the Black Student Union was they kind of backed down because they didn't want to offend other Black people during the brunch who were kind of wrapped up in uh, this white institutionalized event, if that makes sense.
mhm.
Um, and so I guess that's one thing I've realized is like, yes, so you have the big bang of African American, or sorry, you have the big bang of Black studies, particularly African American studies. And as it's gone along in time, there's a delineation happening, right? And for me, like, I think part of that, part of the reason why it's stifling is because instead of adapting in terms of, okay, we have to do this the Appalachian way. In my case, it's like we're trying to get back to what it was, and those days at least are frankly gone, you know? And so we have to evolve, we have to adapt, and we have to find new ways of doing things.
So what are some of the new ways, right? Like what do you think the future of Black studies is going to be,
Yeah.
particularly in spaces that are more conservative and have laws and policies being passed that are combative to the institutionalization of the field itself?
Yeah, I think part of it is okay, I should say I am not one of those, like, rainbow coalition, like, down with the white ally, off the bat type of scholar, right? I ironically, a lot of my colleagues are in a way, in that I think that it is naive to think that, um, always allying with white people is going to bode well. However, when you're in a situation to wherein that's all you're kind of surrounded with, and these are the ones who have power. Sometimes you have to monopolize off of that interest convergence as much as you can within the institution. But with outside of the institution, you have to build those third spaces, kind of like the Martin and Hardy call, like, the undercommons,
Mhm.
where you have, like, the infrastructure in place where you can communicate, you can share resources, you can share mutual aid, you can teach classes outside of the institution. And I know people who do that on social media and things of that nature. And so I think in an if you resistance is incredibly important. And that's what I've spent my last 2 years doing. The problem is it will wear you down to a nub, to the point where you are just incredibly exhausted. And that's where I think everybody at OU is in terms of Black faculty. That's where we're at right now. So instead of putting that energy towards the inevitable and towards of I don't wanna say roll over and take it, but my point is that there becomes a point wherein whatever changes they're gonna make, they're gonna make. Whatever it is they're gonna do, they're gonna do, right? And so we have to take care of each other and fostering uh other spaces, other avenues of communication, and I've worked with that. It's very difficult to do. It's incredibly difficult to do, and it takes a long time, but it's at this point in time, it's kind of all we got, at least for us. So,
Is there anything so outside of the challenges that Black studies is facing right now,
yeah.
um, is there anything that excites you about where it can go in the future, given that that institutionalization might not be the, um, central focal point of it moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, the prospect of isn't that what we need anyway, right? Like, isn't that what a lot of Black folks are kind of hungry for right now is community, right? Outside of institutionalization. And that's another thing. I don't know what it's like in other parts of the US, but in Appalachia, every institution is incredibly extractive. They come in, they gobble up the resources, they suck the life out of the region, they provide ephemeral jobs, and at OU, in many ways it has done that, and so it has burned the Black community, um, around in and around Athens to the point where it can be difficult to be an agent of the institution and trying to engage with the community, right? Even though, like, you're down with them, like, I totally 100% agree, they still are gonna see you in the institutional role, which is completely fair, and so I guess one of the silver linings, of this is, like, uh through the activism and through kinda getting it out the mud, you make some great connections because they start to see, like, you're getting you're getting screwed just as we were, right? And trying to build these I think I have been relatively successful in building, like, these, meeting spaces wherein we can routinely come together, and I don't mean when I mean we, I don't mean faculty, I mean, maybe a few faculty and then members of the community routinely come together and kind of build relationships. For example, I had my students do like an underground railroad project last year, wherein they were looking at the various sites between Athens, Ohio, and Canada. And from that, we have created kind of like I don't want to say support group, but kind of like an informal group between me and some of those various sites that my students identified, and a lot of them are women, right? And that's another thing is women, the role of women in like storytelling and oral traditions and things of that nature. And so through that work, I've kind of stepped around or stepped through the institutional, I guess, what is that? Like the Iron Gate, and have tried to uh, really make connections with other people, because what is happening is uh, it's what is happening right now is not just happening in higher education, but these historical sites and societies are also struggling too, right? So we have that in common. Yes, yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. So
Thank you. So, is there anything you want to add? Any upcoming or current projects you'd like to talk about?
sure. So um my I would say my research agenda is very eclectic, and that's because I have various interests that I mean, there's a through line, but I've been dabbling in the humanities a little bit since, they've gotten me to think about, things in a new way. But one thing I'm working on right now with my students is conducting a round of focus groups of Black American, well, not just Black Americans, Black faculty and admin who have lost their jobs, due to DEI retrenchment across the nation. Last semester, it was just within OU, and so we're taking that nationwide. Um, I have a community sourced book project going on for Black women who and girls who have experienced miscarriage, stillbirth, termination for medical reasons. So those are kind of the main two things I'm working on now, and when I get overwhelmed or fatigued with one, I kind of bounce back to the other. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Mm.
I appreciate being able to talk to you today. And I think that research on and about both aging while Black as well as Black Appalachia is so important. So, thank you for that work as well.
Of course, and thanks for having me.
No problem. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.